All right, welcome. Hello.
What's up, everybody?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Matt Antonell. I'm the host of the Ask Us Anything podcast. I'm here with Pastor Nathaniel Lee. Nathaniel, we have three categories of questions we got this week.
Lots of questions.
One of them we might not get to this week is we got some community group questions, which is one thing I want to emphasize. If in your community groups you have any questions come up, that's a good time to compile those questions and send them in so that Nathaniel can answer those. So we have some community group questions. We have some questions about the Sabbath, which is what Nathaniel preached on this past week. If you haven't seen the sermon, it is linked in the description on YouTube, and you should watch that before watching this, because things will make a lot more sense. And then a third category of questions, we got some questions relating to the podcast from last week. So if you have questions about what we say this week, feel free to ask questions, and in the next week we'll try to address them the best we can.
Yeah. Also, if you ever just want a phone call too, that's good too.
That's true. Yeah. If you're ever like furious at Nathaniel, then
It's true.
then just know where his office is. You can find him.
Where I live.
I'll be posting his address in the description, and you can.
Please don't.
Okay, so let's hit on the Sabbath stuff first. The first question I want to ask is work subjective based on the person? Are there right and wrong ways to specifically do the Sabbath? I have an example of this.
Please.
I was thinking of going for a run. Going for a run for me is definitely work.
100%.
But for other people, I can definitely envision them saying like, "Oh, this is my Sabbath day. I want to go for a run. That's what makes me feel good." They wouldn't view that as work. So what do you think there? What are your thoughts there?
I think that's a great example of how it is it is subjective, but it's also not subjective. So it is subjective in the sense that what one person might find restful, another person might find exhausting. I'm the same way with running. Like, I just don't like running. Yeah, but that's a subjective. I know some people that might run and legitimately feel rested. The one exception to that would be if you run for a living, like, or you're an athlete. Like, I would encourage those that are, athletes for a living, maybe don't exercise on the Sabbath. If you're a fisherman for a living, maybe don't go fishing on the Sabbath. So kind of like try to do something avocational that's distinct, maybe even a distinct mode. So is it subjective? Yes and no. It's subjective in the sense that yes, people can find different things restful, but no, it's not subjective in the sense that I do think those three principles are still there. So if it consistently causes you to miss corporate worship, and emphasis on consistently, because of course, like, we have health complications, or we might even have a season, like a month or two, where at our work or some other thing cause us to miss corporate worship. But if it's a consistent thing, try to avoid that. If it's consistently preventing you from resting, try to avoid that. And if it's consistently preventing you from having deep delight, then try to avoid that. So in that sense, it's not subjective. And I think a helpful grid of questions would just be helpful, because we don't want to be overly strict. That was partially what Jesus was pushing back to, and like, what can I do and what can I do? But I do think we've drifted to the opposite extreme, to where most of us don't even Sabbath anymore. And we never think twice, hardly any of us, at least in our context, think twice about what we do on the Sabbath. So the grids would essentially just, go on those three areas of worship. Like, does it help me dive deeper into corporate worship? And does it prevent me from going to corporate worship? If it consistently prohibits you from going to corporate worship, probably don't do it. Does it help me rest? And just really ask honestly that question. I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about wedding planning, and how they were like, should we do wedding planning on the Sabbath? And again, I think to some degree that's subjective, in the sense that, like, is it exhausting to you? And that person was saying, well, I feel really good when I get it done. And that may be true, that may be good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's restful. I kind of had this conundrum the other day. Like, our stove broke recently, and I'm not a handyman. And so working on a stove would not be restful for me. Do I think I'd be living in sin by like fixing my stove? Not necessarily. I don't think it would be restful. And so that gets to the category that I think we need with all of our Christian life, and maybe we'll even reuse this category when we get to the second set of questions. We're not talking about doing these things for our justification. We're talking about doing these things for our joy. And when Paul talks in Galatians about I've died to the law, he doesn't mean I've died to ever doing anything Jesus asked me to do. He means I've died to the law becoming the means by which I'm justified. And now anything that I do to follow Jesus is not in order to gain my love. It's in order to dive deeper into that. So that's just something to notice. Like when it's like, oh, like I got to beat myself up over, did I do something restful or not restful on Sabbath? Don't think of it that way. But at the same time, don't be apathetic about it. Because if you truly love Jesus, I think one of the ways that we will respond is we have a concern for doing the right thing because we want to dive deeper into that love. And so as you're asking your questions here with the grid of, does it hinder corporate worship? Does it help me rest? And then, I forgot to say, third, does it help me delight? Is it wrong to watch sports on the Sabbath? I don't think necessarily, but it's kind of like, I would encourage you not to say what's wrong and what's right, but what's deeper and what's more shallow. And I think that gets rid of the guilt a lot of the times, but it keeps the hunger for depth. And so there's some times in which you're like, should I watch Parks and Rec for the 15th time this week? And it's not like, it's horrible for you to watch Parks and Rec on the Sabbath. It's more like, is there a type of rest that it's maybe a little bit more difficult on a Tuesday night when you get home from work to do that you should be doing on a Sunday? Does that make sense? Like, I don't know about you, but like when I have a long day, sometimes I just want to like watch The Office or Parks and Rec, like 25 minutes, very low commitment. And I would just encourage people to think about that delight piece is like, what are things that I just honestly may not have the energy to do? Like a nap or reading a good book or just making a meal and really just taking the time and taking time to eat. So anyway, it's kind of more, yes, subjective, but no, that's a long way to answer that question. But yeah.
That reminds me too of what you said on Sunday about holy being something set apart.
Yeah.
And if Monday through Friday, every night you're sitting there watching Parks and Rec, then maybe on Sunday there's something different that can make that day holy in the terms that it's different from your Monday through Friday and set apart and different.
Absolutely. Are you saying yes to things on the Sabbath that you don't get to say yes to the other 6 days? And are saying no to things on the Sabbath that you really shouldn't say no to the other 6 days? And if not, you kind of do have to ask, is the Sabbath being kept set apart? Which again is what the term holy means, as we talked about on Sunday.
Yeah. You mentioned this, you said that we, or as Christians in general, have often kind of rejected the Sabbath or not taken it seriously, or if I can be completely honest, it wasn't until roughly a year ago that my wife and I started seriously considering, wait, are we supposed to actually be like keeping the Sabbath?
Yeah.
And it's funny now that I reflect back on that, because I'm like, how could I have gone so long without anyone presenting this to me as, hey, have you considered you should really be keeping the Sabbath? And I just, like you said, I kind of just threw it in that category of same category as like those Levitical laws, or as, those Israel, as in that category of things, and never thought of it as part of the creation account. And why do you think do you know of any reason, or do you have any suspicions as to why Christians have done that and kind of separated from it?
It's a really good question. And if it makes you feel better, I have a very similar story. My undergraduate degree is in theology, and I didn't hear a single person talk about Sabbath.
Yeah.
At a Christian school. Like, so the fact that you can do an entire college degree on the Bible, and I didn't hear, maybe I'm not remembering it, but I remember I feel like the first time I thought about it was at Gordon Conwell. One of my professors was like, how many of you all are Sabbathing? And I'm like, what? Like, it wasn't like I disagreed. I never thought about it. And so you're not alone. And I think a lot of our, congregation might be in a similar camp. I'm sure there's a lot of reasons. I'll just list a few, but this is by no means meant to be exhaustive. I think a cultural pull towards hyperproductivity is definitely a significant factor in people not emphasizing the Sabbath. So what I mean by that is, 75 years ago, a lot of the country was closed on Sunday. You go to the South today, you're going to have more restaurants. I don't know about restaurants because Southerners got to eat their food, but I can say that as a Southerner. After church, Shoney's buffet. So, beat the Baptist to the buffet was the slogan. I digress. But a lot of stores would be closed on Sunday to this day. So yeah, I mean, that's, we're obviously drifting away. Blue laws, is that what they're called?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where Sunday was culturally seen as a day off, for the better or worse. And I think because it's becoming more and more difficult to push against the hyperproductivity 7 days a week of culture, I think that's a reason. People are like, well, Sabbath is not really possible in today's day and age. I think there are a variety of theological objections to the Sabbath. I'll just list a few. I think one view of the Sabbath, this is even in some Reformed circles, would say the Sabbath was meant to be a reward for Adam keeping the covenant. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but then they'll go on to say there's some groups in here that would say that was a reward that was forfeited and then regained by Christ, and now the rest is more of a spiritual rest. And so the only part of the Sabbath command that really carries forward is the corporate worship aspect. And secular people are not secular people, non-Christians are not called to keep the Sabbath anymore because it was something that was forfeited at the fall, is a rest for all people. It's now only a rest for God's people. Yeah, I could go into a longer reason, but I'll give you a quick reason why I disagree with that. I don't think pre-Genesis 2:4, any of that stuff is abrogated by the fall. I think it's obviously changed, as we've talked about, but I don't think the image of God is lost in the fall.
Yeah.
It's marred. I don't think the distinctions between male and female are lost at the fall. I don't think creational patterns are lost at the fall. I don't think the Sabbath being holy, it precedes the fall. It even precedes, this week we're going to talk about the covenant of works. It precedes the covenant of works. So I get where some of those theologians are coming from. I'm not fully persuaded. The other arguments I've heard is kind of like they take Jesus's statements against the Pharisees to mean that we should no longer, Sabbath, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I don't know how you take that statement and therefore say the Sabbath no longer exists, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like when Jesus is clarifying the corrections around lust or divorce. He doesn't abrogate the command. He's just clarifying the command. I think another place I've heard people look to is, I'm blanking on where it is, but it's somewhere in Paul's writings where he says, some of you are concerned about days and months, and basically we need to move on from these elementary principles. But I don't think he really mentions Sabbath. I could be wrong there. I think he, in various parts, critiques the way that Sabbath is done in an oppressive way, as Jesus did. But kind of like with our conversation on infant baptism, if you want something to be wholly rejected or changed in the New Testament from the Old, it's got to be kind of clear. And I don't see a clear rejection of the Sabbath. I see clear clarifications. I do think it moved to Sunday, which I wish I would have had more time to talk about on Sunday, but that's really because of the resurrection. So a lot of people would say the Lord's Day is now what we celebrate, and there's some elements of the Sabbath that are incorporated, but they would point out the Sabbath is on Saturday, and that kind of came to fulfillment in Jesus. And now he gives us the Lord Day, which is similar to the Sabbath, but different. But again, creation doesn't go away at redemption. Our Reformed tradition puts a lot of emphasis on Sabbath. So that's how I kind of came back around to it. There's also an interesting resurgence in the Sabbath among some non-denominational churches. John Mark Comer writes a lot on it. I don't know how to categorize that whole camp that he's a part of, but there's just a resurgence. I think it's kind of like the post-Dallas Willard, Richard Foster, Eugene Peterson, West Coast vibe that is getting interested. I should say is getting interested. They've caused a lot of people to get interested in spiritual disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's maybe more than you wanted, but those are just each of those things could be talked about for a long time, but that's kind of a few reasons why.
Mm-hmm. All of the things you've said about Sabbath, are these, Westminster Confession beliefs? Are these Nathaniel Lee beliefs? Are these held within Center Grace beliefs?
Yeah.
Where does this stand within
That's
that?
great. Yeah, so the Sabbath command, it's all Westminster Confession.
Okay.
I don't take any exceptions to the confession on the Sabbath, with one exception. And I personally don't think it's an exception of substance, but our presbytery does, so I have to trust what they say.
Mm-hmm.
I take exception to what's called the recreation clause in the Westminster Confession, which prohibits worldly recreations. I agree with the statement in the confession on that, insofar as I think that if recreations prevent you from delighting, resting, or corporate worship, they should not be done. But I don't think playing soccer in the backyard with your kid on a Sunday afternoon is breaking the Sabbath.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that the Westminster Divines who wrote the confession thought that either. There's debate on what they thought, because recreation looked different in the 1640s. But I would encourage you all. I'm blanking on the chapter number, but there's a whole chapter on the Sabbath. I subscribe wholeheartedly to it, and all our leadership does too. And it's very everything that I preached on Sunday was in line with that, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay.
Maybe it wasn't as clear as the confession, but yeah, I'd encourage people to read that to know where our church stands. In terms of where the confession fits in all of the rest of the church, it's one of the strongest views on the Sabbath, for the better or worse. Better or worse meaning if you disagree with the Sabbath. I'm not going to lie to you and say that the Presbyterian view is the normal view. A lot of people don't hold to as depending on your view of it, robust or strict view of the Sabbath, depending on it, but a positive and a negative word there. But yeah, I wholeheartedly subscribe to the confession, as does all our leadership.
Okay. One specific question, and I thought this had actually been something that I had thought during your preaching, your sermon. What if your delight in the Sabbath causes others to break Sabbath? And the example they give is going out to eat, the movies, the spa. Is that considered? And then they say, is that considered causing others to stumble?
Yeah.
But you could also just say, is that causing others to, or disabling them from having a Sabbath?
It's a great question. And I think going back to what we just talked about with what is the confession is ambiguous on this one.
Yeah.
So everything I'm about to say, there's debate on. Now, I'm not going to say much because I honestly don't know. Sure. Meaning this is one of those areas I've wrestled with personally. And I think not to read too much into the question, but I do want to hone in on the word cause. If by cause the person means you are someone was not going to work and they were going to take a Sabbath, and you caused them to work by choosing to delight, then yeah, I would say that's not good. I'm trying to think of some examples of which that might be the case. Because maybe if you're a contractor,
sure,
and you've got some Christians in your company, and something comes up and you're like, hey, can you guys do this for me? I would say that's not good. Mm-hmm. Now, again, there's so much with Sabbath, and that's why I would just encourage everyone to go read the Westminster Confession of Faith chapter on it. There is a possibility for necessity and mercy. So, if you have to cook on the Sabbath, that's not breaking the Sabbath because you have to eat. So that's a necessity. Acts of mercy are a friend calls you and is like, hey, or maybe your daughter is 16, 17-year-old and is like, hey, I have a flat tire. Can you come help me? You're not, hopefully as a father or as a mother or even as a friend, you're not going to be like, it's the Sabbath. The way one person put it, honestly can't remember who said this. You're doing everything you can to rest, but also rest and worship, but helping others to do the same. So with the area of restaurants, I say this, there's certain things I say in this podcast that I'm more confident than others. Mm-hmm. This is one of those areas that I need to think more about. I'm not sure, but my hunch is that if a restaurant is already open on Sundays and you going is not gonna cause anyone to break the Sabbath because they already were going to be there. I personally I'm not sure that's causing another person to stumble, especially if, well, I do think the Sabbath is a call for all people. I think our confession does make that clear. There's a debate in the Reformed world about, is the Sabbath just for Christians or for non-Christians? I kind of dipped my toes into that. I don't want to get into that two kingdoms view. There's a debate in that world. But that touches down here because are unbelievers living in rebellion by not taking a Sabbath? And I would say somewhat yes. But are you therefore then causing them to sin by going to a restaurant? I don't think so. Because again, how far do you want to take that argument, right? Like, are you, like, I remember there was a lot of debate between some people in the church in Scotland where they got really nitpicky about, like, if you take the train to church, are you causing others? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I would say no, tentatively, unless you have influence over them. Does that make sense? Like, I use the example of employer. Like, if you obviously have it. So if you're an employer, so to whatever degree you're a boss or a teacher or a parent, it's your responsibility to set a culture of Sabbath. But the influence category is a gray area. Maybe you have a wedding photographer and you're hitting them up on their day off, or a realtor. I would try to give them a day off as much as possible. I remember even when we were looking to buy, I tried to tell our realtor, she was great. I was like, I'm going to try not to bother you like all the time. She was like, no, it's fine. But I was trying to actually, maybe I overstepped, but I was like, you should take a day off. You're going to die. But she was a hard worker, and I tried, but I don't know if it would have been wrong for me to always bother her, but I tried because that was running through my head though. Especially on Sundays. Like, do I want to bother her on my day off? So
it seems like with these things, there's an infinite amount of dissecting that can go into
sure.
Okay, my air conditioner breaks. Should I call the AC technician? My going out to food, and we can kind of get preoccupied with the legalism and the restrictive access of it, or the restrictive aspect of it, and lose sight of the point.
Yeah. Run it through a grid and move on.
Yeah.
Because there have been times where I make different calls, and I'm not saying those calls I made were right, but I think what the devil wants us to do is spend the rest of the Sabbath feeling guilty about doing something. And it's just like, this isn't for our justification. I think if Jesus was getting after anything, it was that.
I mean, Jesus was asked questions about this specifically, right?
Right. And he didn't abrogate the Sabbath, but he was like, guys, it's not meant to be a burden.
Yeah.
So good question, but I would run it through that quick grid. Am I causing others? Again, emphasis on the word cause.
Yeah.
And I would just say, when you go out to a restaurant, you're not causing, but could be wrong.
Can I wait till Monday?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now to some questions regarding last week's podcast, which was on the cultural mandate: be fruitful, multiply, get out there, make disciples. Overpopulation. How do you reconcile the fact that some argue the world is overpopulated or becoming overpopulated with your call from last week's podcast for people to have more children? What are your thoughts on that?
Super complex, but I do think super complex issue. I think people have been saying the world is too overpopulated for a while now. The guy that I forgot to Google his name, 1780s, 90s, starts with an M. He was the one that came along and said, we're nearing 1 billion people, I think.
Are you talking about, someone had written a book that was like the population bomb or something like that?
That was in the 60s. Yeah, there was something before that, though, I think. What was his name?
Yeah, because we were already a couple billion.
Mathus or something like that. But he was just basically like, whenever we hit a certain amount of people, the world can't sustain. And, reasonable concern. We want to be responsible about the future. But I mean, we're 8 times larger as a world than when he was writing, and there's fewer people percentage wise starving than there were in the 1700s. Obviously there's more total people. It's because there's 8 billion people on the earth. And so I think a lot of conditions are actually better than they were in the 1800s. Sure, there's, plenty of tragic conditions people are living in. I don't think a lot of the people that are living in tragic conditions are because we don't have the resources to feed them. It's because of wealth distribution problems. So I think we make more food now than we ever have on less land than we ever have, right? Like we have fewer farmland because of, developments, but we're making more food. Human ingenuity is a gift of God. Praise God for all these technologies. So I'm not super persuaded by that argument. As we were talking about before this, I do think there is a popular, I shouldn't say popular, an increasingly popular mentality among Western elites, ironically, usually wealthy, that discourages having children for the sake of the planet. And I would just say that's kind of the opposite of what the text is saying. In Genesis 1:28, it's saying, be fruitful and multiply for the good of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, has population growth led to a lot of, climate detriment? Of course. But I would just argue not necessarily so. I would say I would blame that more on greed and exploitation and colonial. There's a lot of other things I would blame that on, not having kids. And I think you and I were talking about this earlier. Like, I think there's if we're just doing this from an economic standpoint or a, survival of the world standpoint, we need to have kids to like figure out the problems of climate control.
Yeah.
Not climate control, creation care. I'm not going to use climate control. Creation care is, I think, a more robust category. Because if we're saying like, oh, the world's going to crap and therefore we shouldn't have kids, that's not a biblical mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Because the biblical that doesn't have hope. Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and he affirmed Genesis 1. Be fruitful and multiply. And so, if someone wants to say, I only want to have one or two kids for financial or medical reasons, totally makes sense. I mean, it's so expensive. And as we were talking about in the other room, I think it may be wise for people to say, I only want one or two or three kids, in a way that it wasn't wise, or as wise, I should say, 500 years ago, because I don't remember what the average, family had, but I want to wager it was like five or six.
Sure.
But
and they lost like half before the age of 5.
But a lot of them sadly died. And so there was part of the reason for population growth is not about people are having more kids as much as it is people just aren't dying as much because of, obviously everyone dies, but you know what I mean? Like most families don't have a child die in the first, 18 years of their life. Or at least it's not anywhere close to, the child mortality rate is not anywhere close to what it was, even 100 years ago, let alone 500. And so is there a wisdom in having fewer kids? There could be. I don't want it. Some people might choose to have fewer kids and some people might choose to have more kids. There's nothing wrong with either. I was just making all that comment to say it makes more sense now than it did because there's not those, I'm using the word natural in scare quotes here, natural population control through diseases and whatnot because our medicines have gotten so much better. All that to say, I think as a society in the US, a lot of people are beginning to talk about the fertility rates dropping too rapidly.
Sure.
And of course, people would say, well, we're still growing as a country. Well, it's because the boomer generation is mostly still alive. So of course we're still growing. But how much longer will we still grow? When you and I are 50, I don't think we'll have, what are we at, 370, 380 million? If these trends continue, I think sociologists say we're not going to keep growing as a country. And there's a lot of, possible fallout for that. But yeah, I would just push back against the mentality. I see a lot in our culture that we should be afraid to have kids. I think the Bible has the opposite mentality. Let's have courage. Let's raise our kids not to coddle them, but to send them out on mission, that their life they are not their own, and they are meant to serve the world, not to consume, but to serve. That's what the world needs. The world doesn't need less people. It needs people to serve the world. And yeah, I could go on, but I'm not persuaded by that argument that some people are making, that overpopulation means we shouldn't have kids.
Yeah.
And it's something like 80 countries have, I read this last night, 80 countries have achieved what is known as a below replacement fertility. 80. The point at which women are having so few children, generally thought to be below 2.1 children per woman, that countries are no longer replacing themselves. The UN predicts that every nation on earth, with the exception of a few African nations, will reach below this means reach below replacement fertility within the next 20 years. So this is not just a U.S. problem. I think you're seeing Shohei, one of our missions partners in Japan, is talking about how Japan is a little bit ahead of the curve on this. Meaning, I think I could be wrong in this, but I think there's a higher percentage of people over the age of 65 than under 15.
Mm-hmm.
So do some like thinking about how that would affect a society. It basically means that the elderly are not going to be a good place. It really, that's what we're seeing in colleges right now.
Sure.
Colleges are not doing so hot for a number of reasons, but one of them is there's just fewer kids coming up, and that's only going to grow. So it's not sustainable, but it's also, I would argue, like not born from a mindset that the Bible calls us to have hope.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's interesting actually. In Japan, you want a free house, move to Japan. There's thousands of abandoned homes in Japan just because they don't have the population to repopulate.
Can we pick them up and move them to the North Shore?
Exactly. And the issue in Japan is it's super expensive to renovate because the recycling and all that stuff is so expensive.
Oh, wow.
So you can get a house for free, but to remodel it will cost you a fortune.
Right.
But on a lot of these things, it's interesting. This is kind of, everything nowadays has become politicized.
Yeah.
Population, and now there's people, and I don't know why this has become politicized, but it seems like, certain people are saying we're overpopulated, we need to cut back on people, and then I'm seeing the opposite where people are saying no, we don't have enough people, we need to have more people, and that's usually driven from an economic standpoint, right? Like they're saying, well, if you look at the U.S. numbers and we're not hitting our replacement numbers, then the population is going to decline, and a declining population is catastrophic for economies.
Right.
But a lot of these things are nitty gritty, kind of like details on things that you're not an expert on. I'm not an expert on. You're more here to talk about the theology behind it, the biblical perspective behind it. You're not here to debate the specifics, the statistics,
sure,
those types of things.
Totally. And the one thing I'd focus on there is like the Bible does not call us to have a spirit of fear. And the cultural mandate is the distinct, almost the opposite of basically the calls to, again, from the quote I read last week, who said the guy said it was irresponsible to have children.
Yeah.
That's not I just don't see how the authors of scripture would be okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And talking more about kids, I think we did want to clarify or elaborate a little bit more on the podcast from last week. We were talking about this outside of the room. What do we want to talk about there? I mean, there was a bunch of things about last week's podcast that we wish we had elaborated on or stated more clearly.
For sure. Yeah. Cause it was one of those things that, I don't know if we said anything that we disagree with now, but maybe could have been more clear on. I'm like Michael Scott. What's that quote? Sometimes I start a sentence and I don't know where I'm going. I just hope I find it along the way. With the contraception one, I hadn't thought about that in 7 years. So thanks, Matt, for plunging me back into my college existential crisis. No, I'm just kidding. It actually has caused me to go back and rethink it. So yeah, again, just to reiterate something maybe I wasn't as clear on last week. I think I said this, but maybe I don't think I was super clear. I don't know if we can definitively say contraception, birth control are wrong, but I still think we should pause and consider Catholic and earlier Protestant arguments. That's all. The church doesn't have an official position on contraceptions. We just would encourage both sides to consider the other side. I mean, I'm not personally against contraception. I just feel a little odd about it. That doesn't necessarily mean that therefore your pastor says they're wrong. It's just whenever I see the vast majority of church history going one way, it makes me feel uneasy that I'm on the other side. So yeah, just a helpful resource there. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church had a New Horizons 1996 issue that had 3 articles on this. Before you use birth control, consider blank. You may not use birth control because blank, and you may use birth control if. And it was just kind of 3 different positions. And I think this is a helpful resource I think all Christians should be responsible enough to read the different views on this and not critique people on either side. So if you're in our congregation and you believe that contraception is a wise contraceptives, I'm sorry, is a wise path for you for whatever reason. I mean, that's I think to some degree like an area of conscience.
Sure.
I don't know if the Bible provides a clear command on that. I do think though that the Bible says it's a good thing to have children. It's a blessing to have children, and when you can, you should probably try. With the exception of maybe like medical or extreme circumstances. Yeah, go for it.
Can I restate what I thought my takeaway from what you said last week?
Please do.
Was when you're examining whether or not to have children and you decide not to, you asked us to examine why that was.
Right.
And to ask yourself, honestly, is there an idol there?
Yeah.
Or is there, what are the motives behind that?
Yeah.
And people have come at this and they have a wide range of reasons.
Yeah.
And actually one of these questions asks about this. I'll ask this in a second. And it's a lot of those reasons aren't selfish reasons.
Sure.
And I don't think we said that it was selfish. I think someone had, I'll ask a question in a second. They had thought that we were implying, or perhaps we implied that it was selfish to not have children. But I mean, I had mentioned my friend who had cystic fibrosis, and for her, it was a life-threatening possibility to conceive and have it and bear a child, right?
Sure.
So she's looking at it from a very different perspective of I could die if I try and carry a child.
Right, which is qualitatively different.
Yeah, versus someone who's 25. I'm seeing this more and more often. There's like 25-year-old men who are getting vasectomies, or 30-year-old men who are getting vasectomies, and they're just saying, "Oh yeah, I've decided against this for my life," and that's not something I'm interested in. But all that to say, the main thing that I had seen from you, or that I had taken away from what you had said, was that we should ask ourselves, why are we saying no to kids, and is there an idol there?
Yeah, no, totally. And to like reiterate something I said last week about I'll just use my own story, right? Like we used contraceptives in seminary, right? And so like, cause we were nervous that, we're both full-time students, and we kind of deemed it wise, like, I'm not sure we're in a place to have kids right now. Like we're both working part-time, we're both full-time students. If we have a child, one of us will probably have to drop our schooling.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'll counterbalance that, which I probably should have mentioned that last week, with what I did say last week, which is I have an idol of financial security. And so I'm not saying what we did was wrong. I'm not sure I would change what we did. I just think I should have critically examined my heart a little more to say, if the Lord did want to give us a child, would I trust him in it? Would I trust that his word says this is a blessing? Of course, children are burdensome in some ways, but they're more of a blessing. And do I trust the blessing? Which is a word from God. And that comes down to, it's like, do you believe God or not? But that doesn't mean, again, so people use contraceptives for a lot of reasons, and it may be wise. Yeah, but like you said, I just think we should always, not just with this issue, but almost any issue, just always ask the tough questions of our hearts. Is this really about wisdom, or is this about my idolatry? And that's a remarkably challenging conversation. I just think all of us should have it in our prayer lives before the Lord. But yeah, of course, like for some people, they may say, we want to wait to have kids for financial reasons, or maybe we should stop at 1 or 2 for financial or medical or emotional reasons. I know a lot of women have incredibly traumatic births, and they say, like, I just don't know if I can do it again. And yeah, there's no problem with that. I do think though, and we'll get to this in a second, the cultural mandate still applies. That I think what we were trying to go after is the mentality that says, oh, it's purely an inconvenience. And I think that is the mentality that I think the Bible would challenge. Like if you financially can, if you medically can, if you biologically can, if you emotionally can, and at the end of the day, you're like, no, I don't want kids because that would make me uncomfortable. And that's the only reason. I don't know. I think you should just, at the very least, like, just consider some of the implications of the cultural mandate. If your only reasons are like your own comfort.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Is that harsh? I don't know.
No, that does. Honestly, it resonates with me personally. when my wife and I are in the process of adopting a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And when we entered the adoption process, we had basically said, "Oh, we're interested in an infant." And then this 5-year-old was presented to us. They said, "This isn't what you were interested in, like based on what you had written down, and what are you interested in being presented this case?" And I was like, "Oh, that's my initial impulse was that's not what I envisioned for my family. That's not what I envisioned." And then my wife, Katie, was like, "Don't you think we should pray about this? Don't you think we should, like, why wouldn't we consider this?"
Right.
And just asking the question of why wouldn't we consider it? And I couldn't come up with a good reason why we wouldn't consider it.
Wow.
And that led us to the place we are now. And now I can't imagine if we hadn't gone in that direction.
Sure. That's so good. And that's such a wise thing for Katie to do. But it's also, like, I think a good example of what I think we're all called to do, whether it's with having children or honestly like a vocational discernment or geographical move. It's always like lay down our preconceived ideas before the Lord and say, is this of you or not?
Yeah. That question I had alluded to earlier. Here we go. You said one of the main reasons married couples don't have kids is a commitment to individualism. And in that there was an implied selfishness. However, it seems to be a blanket statement that is largely unfair. The question goes on to give an example of a couple who gives away 40% of their income. They volunteer, they visit the sick. They're great, selfless people. And this person asked you to clarify.
And that couple's childless.
Yes, a childless couple.
Right. Yeah.
Is that couple selfish?
No. Yeah, I think this is a good. I'm thankful for the question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we used the phrase selfishness. Maybe we did. I don't know.
I had said at one point that entering into a marriage or entering into being parenting is a selfless endeavor, in that if you enter into it thinking, what is this going to do for me? It's going to be a difficult task. But I didn't mean to imply, that's the closest thing I could think. I didn't mean to imply that, oh, it's so selfless of you to have kids, right?
Sure. Yeah.
You said these kids are a blessing, right? And they're wonderful. It's most people who have kids say it's the greatest thing that ever happened to them. They're not saying this is my cross to bear.
Right. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. And maybe
I don't think we said that it would.
I tried to go back and listen, but it's rough to listen to yourself. I'm like, wow, how do people do this?
How do you do it?
How do people listen to me? But yeah, so just a couple of comments on this. The questioner said, a commitment to individualism. Yeah, I don't think individualism is something that you're committed to. I think it's a cultural water. Like I think I talked about social imaginary.
You did.
Okay, I don't remember when I say things where, but
sure,
it all runs together. It's subconscious most of the time. So I don't think anybody wakes up and is like, I'm going to choose to be individualistic today. I think all of us, Christians included, myself included, are individualistic. Almost every person if you live in America right now, with some rare exceptions, if you grew up in America and you are an American citizen, chances are, like if you've been shaped by this culture, but more than another culture, I'd say the only exception to this is if like you grew up in Pakistan and you moved here a year ago, like you're shaped by a collectivist culture, not an individualistic culture, probably. Almost every one of us is individualistic. And I don't think individualism is always wrong. I think it's good that we can choose our jobs, or, spouses or geographical locations. Those are all products of individualism, a culture of individualism, I should say. That being said, I think individualism can be taken to unhealthy extremes, and our society is probably I haven't thought about this for a whole lot, but I would wager it's in, the top 10% of the world in terms of individualism. Alexis de Tocqueville said the same thing, right? It's like the most individualistic place. Robert Bella, sociologist, expressive individualism is rampant in our country. Charles Taylor, all the sociologists will say, very individualistic place. Here's what I love Charles Taylor's definition of individualism the most. And here's why I will stand by our statement that I do think in a culture of individualism, it leads to people not wanting to have kids. This isn't what he says. The culture, or he also calls it the culture of authenticity. The culture of authenticity is one where each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our own humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own as opposed to surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from the outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. I don't think anybody would argue that that's not the mentality of almost every American. Again, myself included, like, I don't want the government to tell me what to do, like with my religion. You know, almost every American would say that. Now, I think that can lead, and very often does lead to, I don't want to have children because it prohibits me from realizing my own humanity. And it prohibits me from finding and living out my own, my own humanity, my own happiness, basically. But of course, that doesn't mean, so that's the principle. I think the principle is true.
Sure.
You could even look at Pew Research. They surveyed why people don't want to have kids in 2021, and they said more than half listed their main reason as don't want to have children, meaning like they choose not to, as opposed to financial, medical, environmental. There was a lack of interest in having kids. I think it was, I want to say 60% of people. So the vast majority of people, it's not for the reasons that this person listed. So these couples, 20-40% of their income, they volunteer regularly to visit the sick. Of course, they're not selfish. And obviously, of course, every parent is not selfless, right?
Sure.
You can choose to have kids for selfish reasons. Many people do. I'm sure there's been selfishness in my own heart. But just because there's exceptions to a pattern doesn't mean the pattern's wrong. It would be like if I said, which is sociologically proven, that if you go to college, you tend to make a higher amount of income after college than not. Now, if someone said, well, I know plenty of people who don't go to college, therefore you're wrong. It's like, well, no, like, of course there's plenty of people who don't go to college.
My friend's a millionaire. He didn't
Right.
go to college.
Exactly.
So how does that fit with your statement? It's like, well, the statement is still true that generally the expected income from someone who goes to college is going to be higher.
And on the flip side, it also doesn't mean that everyone who goes to college will make a lot of money.
Sure.
So I would say that's the same statement. Just because individualism leads to people choosing not to want to have kids, it doesn't mean that everybody who chooses not to have kids is doing it for selfish reasons.
Yeah.
And it also doesn't mean that, everyone who does have kids is doing it for selfish reasons.
There's plenty of selfless people without kids.
Absolutely.
That's the easiest statement to make.
Yeah. So put it another way, I'm not concerned with who's more selfish.
Yeah.
The concern is, what is the motives behind the vast majority of people not wanting to have kids? And according to Pew, it's purely just a lack of interest. And I really want to say, I think that lack of interest is rooted in a culture of individualism, and we should really examine that a little bit more deeply and really reckon with, Heidelberg Catechism, question 1, my life is not my own, which is the exact opposite of what everyone in our culture is saying, which is my life is my own. But let's tease out the implications. Now, if you want to say my life is not my own, and instead of choosing to have kids, I want to spend every waking moment, or not every week, but I want to be able to give a whole lot more money, and that's a much more reasonable reason. Reasonable reason, is it? Yeah.
That's much more reasonable.
It's much more reasonable. There we go. Dang it. You know what I'm trying to say.
Words are hard.
Words are difficult. That's much more biblical, Christ-like, we could even say, of a posture than the person that's, I think what we were trying to get after yesterday was a lot of our friends and people our age are just choosing not to have kids so that they can spend more money on themselves. But of course, that doesn't mean that everybody who's not choosing to have kids is doing that. You could, I think, argue, I think John Piper has an article on this where maybe you want to be a frontier missionary in a place that you might die. And maybe not having kids might be wise. I say might because I'm not going to say then if you choose to have kids, that's irresponsible. But yeah, if your goal is I want to be as selfless with my time, me and my wife or me and my husband feel called to, be as hospitable as possible, that makes sense. I would just encourage that couple to consider children not as an obstacle to that. and to consider that, just the cultural mandate.
Yeah.
Just to consider.
And back to what you said, consider why you would do things, why you wouldn't.
Yeah.
And is there an idol there?
Yeah.
There was a question about the sex without potency is more transactional. Do you want to do that one?
Yeah, for sure.
I'll read the whole thing. I honestly don't know entirely what this question is asking, so I'm just gonna lob it over to you, and you can do your best.
Sweet.
Good luck. You said sex without potency is more transactional.
I had to Google what potency means.
But people like Judah in Genesis are a prime example of knowing the risks, but he chose to have transactional sex anyways. That's the part I'm a little confused on. There were many cases in the Bible where sex was purely transactional, where childbearing was the purpose. Could you explain in light of the wording here is a little off. I'm going to do my best. Could you explain in light of how sex becomes more transactional with contraception than it was when people just wanted to have sex to extend their family line?
Yeah, great question. Okay. So sex without the possibility of having kids can be more transactional. Especially I was mostly referring, and I'm glad this person asked this question because it's a helpful clarification. I was referring more to couples having sex outside of marriage when I talk about transactional. Because obviously if you're married to someone, it's to some degree, like, you can't as easily have transactional sex in a marriage because you live together. You know what I mean? Like, obviously people that are married, there's spousal abuse and there's real problems with that. And I'm not denying any of that. I'm just saying, like, it's qualitatively different to have sex with your spouse with using contraceptives than if you're just hooking up with people on contraceptives. And I think what I was getting at last week was it enables sex to be more transactional outside of the covenant marriage because you have no significant fear of producing a child afterward. And so it can become something, I give you my body, you give me yours, we leave here, the deals, we're not signing any long-term commitment, there's no child. So that's the comments there.
It's just a lot easier to have that mentality.
Oh, a lot easier. Yeah.
I'm going to sleep around, I don't have to worry about it.
100%. And I'll unpack, maybe the next question kind of gets at the same dynamic, but I'll save more thoughts for that question. In terms of Judah, Judah was a horrible person. The Bible the only thing Judah ever does well is repent. So description of a biblical character does not mean prescription. So Judah did have transactional sex with what he thought was a cultic prostitute, but surprise, it was Tamar, his daughter-in-law, right? So having sex with a cultic prostitute was transactional. I probably should know this, but I don't know how the cultic prostitutes in that time prevented getting pregnant. I don't know if they routinely just took potions, is what they called them, abortifacient, stuff. I don't know. I don't know how that worked. I'm assuming that your average cultic prostitute was she a cultic prostitute or was she just a prostitute? I don't remember. But anyway, your average prostitute in the ancient Near East is probably not assuming to get pregnant, and there's usually some way that, they couldn't do their job if they were getting pregnant every single time they had sex. And so, that was transactional, and that was clearly frowned upon, and the Lord, condemns what Judah does. Now, to the third part of the question, there are many cases in the Bible where sex was purely transactional or childbearing was the purpose. This is the one I want to push back on because I don't think where childbearing is a purpose within a covenant of marriage, I don't think that's transactional. Our confession says this, so this isn't me, this is the confession. Marriage was ordained for the mutual help of husband and wife, meaning these are all the reasons listed in Westminster Confession of Faith, part 2, or 24:2. Supposed to help husband and wife. For the increase of mankind with legitimate issue and of the church with a holy seed. I love that phrase, the holy seed. I have a funny inside joke about that, but I won't go into that. It's a Pentecostal story where someone was told a pastor, you have a holy seed, meaning that his son was called to be ordained. It was really funny. I digress. So the confession says that one of the main purposes of marriage, the purposes of marriage are husband and wife are they grow closer together. They love one another, mutually satisfied with one another. There's increase of humankind, in a legitimate way, basically the cultural mandate. The church grows, making disciples, and preventing of uncleanness. Those are kind of the 4 reasons in the confession. And so to say that like when childbearing is a purpose is transactional, I don't think it's transactional. Now, if you're like only getting married to someone to have kids, that's not good. But I think the Bible would not condone people if the only reason you're getting married is to have kids, and you don't want to grow the church, you don't want to prevent uncleanness, you don't want to actually help your husband or wife, depending on who wants to have kids, then yeah, it's like somewhat transactional. But transactional and covenantal are somewhat mutually antithetical, are mutually exclusive, because like even if you're getting married to someone and the only reason why you want to get married to them is to have kids, you still have to legally bind yourself to them. Mm-hmm. You still are in their family. Like it's unhealthy, but I would not say it's transactional. There might be a transactional component to the marriage, but it is not it's not nearly as transactional as hooking up with somebody, because you're committing yourself to them legally, financially, emotionally. Anyway, yeah, it's unhealthy if that's the only reason why you want to have kids. But getting married, and one of the main purposes of having kids is biblical, right? Like, I mean, that's not a controversial statement. Let me say that again. Or maybe say it in a different way. If you want to have kids, the way to do it is getting married. Now, hopefully you actually like the person you're getting married to. But the Bible never has all these prerequisites about, you need to match each other on the Enneagram or whatnot. It says you need to serve the person, whoever you're married. And so maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. So could you explain in light of how sex becomes more transactional with contraceptives? Yeah, again, I think I was mostly referring to outside of marriage. Because people wanting to extend your family line is not a transactional thing. Because you have to raise the child with the person. And it's in a covenant. It could be more transactional than if you have other purposes alongside of that, but it's not more transactional than what Judah did or what a lot of people do in hookup culture. Mm-hmm. I don't know. To be honest, I'm trying to understand. I see like 3 different questions asked in the question. So I'm trying to understand if they're 3 distinct things.
Which angle they're coming from.
Yeah. Which angle. And so if you ask that question and you want to talk more about it, I'm happy to do that. I'm sorry. When you just have it over text, it's hard to know sometimes the nuance that. Yeah.
Sure. Last question regarding the cultural mandate in last week's podcast.
For sure.
You mentioned last week the Catholic Church believes an increase in contraception use leads to higher abortion rates, more cases of rape, and more one-night stands. Then they go on to kind of say, like, they go on to dispute and talk about statistics surrounding these things.
Yeah.
And whatnot. And then they finish with, in light of there being no data to actually support the view of rape and abortion, how do you use the Bible to support that view?
Yeah. So first comment, I don't think I ever said that abortion rates drop. I went back and listened to it, and I think what I said was confusing. So my apologies for that. What I said is one night stands would decrease. And again, keep in mind, the Catholics are not writing this in 2020. They're writing this in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And they're not talking about specific year-to-year data. They're talking about general cultural shifts. And their argument that I was trying to quote, and I probably spent too much time talking about the Catholic view, it just is interesting to me. I always see the Catholic Church as like the Jedi Order or something. And it's like, it's cool. Even though I disagree with them, I'm like, it's like a cool movie.
Can I ask a clarification on that? Yep. You brought in the Catholic perspective.
Yep.
Were you saying this is the perspective that I agree with 100%? Or were you saying, I think there's a valid points here that we need to wrestle with and ask, or
the latter? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was, yeah, I kind of like went into all like how awesome I thought it was. And I have some disagreements with the nuances of their language of possibility, but I do think I'm just kind of still wrestling with it.
Sure.
It was one of the things I just put on the back burner intellectually until last week.
Yeah.
When you asked it. And so it was more me thinking out loud than me telling you, here's all of my perfect thoughts about it.
But back to what you were saying. You were saying you didn't actually. You went back, listened to the podcast, and you didn't say that.
Yeah, no. So
what you meant to say.
I don't think they or I would say that abortion rates decrease when contraceptives are increased. My comment on abortion, at least again, I think the way I said it was confusing. I think I said something to the effect of one night stands will decrease, especially when abortions are more difficult to come by, especially pre-20th century. So what I meant by that is if, for example, you're in the 1960s when abortion, at least I would presume abortion is a little bit more dangerous in the 60s than it is now, just because all procedures I would assume are more dangerous in the 60s than they are now. Because, we've had 70 or 60 years of medical advances. If contraceptives don't exist in the 60s, which is what the Catholic Church is saying, like just theorizing a hypothetical here, you're hesitant to have a one night stand because there's a possibility of pregnancy, and abortion is not an ideal alternative. It is an alternative, but it's not an ideal alternative for anybody involved. Like even if you're pro-choice, I don't know if many pro-choice people, especially women that have had abortion, they're like,
are trying to get pregnant because they're looking forward to an
yeah,
abortion.
like they would choose to have a contraceptive, or to use a contraception. Oh my gosh, I can't talk. To use contraceptive birth control methods rather than have an abortion. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there, but I don't know if someone that was like, oh, I don't care if I get pregnant and then I'll just go. At the very least, it would just be like way too much of a hassle.
Let's just assume the vast majority of people.
Vast majority. Okay. Yeah. So that was my comment there. I don't think it does decrease abortion rates. I do, as this person conceded, it would decrease if all the contraceptives were wiped off the face of the earth. I think people would not have one night stands as much.
Sure. Also, a lot of this stuff gets into kind of like nitty gritty statistics and application in terms of how these things, in terms of a lot of these things.
Sure.
And you mentioned this last week that you're here to talk about the biblical principles underpinning these things. And you're not going to tell someone how to vote on something. You're not going to tell someone how to, yeah, exactly. Like how to vote on things or what policies to hold and believe. But what you are here to do is start discussions on these things and help to give us biblical foundations for thinking about these things.
For sure. Yeah. And even with contraceptives, it's a good example of like, let's all share the biblical principle of the Lord calls us to be fruitful and multiply in most cases. Contraceptives are a good secondary conversation for us to consider both sides. One thing I did want to address in the question,
sure,
is rape. Like again, super, trigger warning, maybe. Is that the right word? I don't know. Content warning. The person just said, the Catholic Church believes an increase in contraceptives leads to more cases of rape. So, and again, they kind of added this comment at the end. I also don't believe a rapist says, oh, she's on contraceptives, let me rape her. Of course, that I would never say that. No, neither would the Catholic Church or anyone else. I think what they were getting after, and I agree with, and this gets down to the principle, is a culture of objectifying women is a little bit more possible with contraceptives. Not that everyone who uses contraceptives objectifies women, not that contraception is overall wrong, but it's saying, again, as the Pope, it wasn't John Paul II, by the way. I'm blanking on who it was, but it wasn't him. I think I said it. I think it was Pius, maybe, but whatever. They all run together anyway.
I don't know how you know all these popes.
There's just a few. Those are like just the last two.
Sure.
But they're just saying that there tends to be a little bit more of an objectification when the childbearing process is more easily divorced from the sexual act.
Got it.
And I just think that's true. And I think it doesn't cause people to rape women, of course, but it might lead to a culture that would enable that mentality of rape without consequences. So this is a very sad statistic, but I was just curious by virtue of this question. Most rapes aren't, like back alley, like random criminal person coming up. They're between people who know each other. About 51% of female victims of rape reported being raped, this is sad, by an intimate partner and 40% by an acquaintance. And again, this is kind of, the statistics are difficult because understandably a lot of women don't report this because there's a lot of shame
Sure.
and whatnot. But it's super rough guess, but the studies I saw said 75% of rape occurs between people who know each other. Terribly sad, horrible thing to lament. And I don't think everyone's like, oh, everyone's on contraceptives, therefore let's, perform this horrible act. What I will argue, though, is that I think if you're among that 75% who knows a woman, you would pause and hesitate a little bit more if contraceptives never existed. Because, and again, I'm stretching here. This isn't a biblical argument. This is just a theoretical conjecturing. Because I do think you have the possibility, like if you know that there's a consequence to your action a little bit more visibly, like there's a higher chance of getting caught if the woman has a higher chance of getting pregnant, then theoretically you could be accused, if the DNA testing existed or whatnot. Again, that's a stretch. I realize that, but I think that's what the Catholic Church was getting at, was the cultural comment, and not saying that contraceptives lead to rape per se, but more so like that some of the people that tragically might do that would be potentially slightly nudged away from it if there was the possibility of a pregnancy. Because if in a world, but again, we don't live in a world where contraceptives don't exist.
So if we're to distill this down, because that was a lot of words, and I actually think at the end you gave an example. Okay, if we're to distill this down, contraceptives may contribute towards a culture that is more objectifying towards women,
right?
And that has implications.
Sure, but that doesn't make contraceptives wrong.
Yeah. Does that work?
Yeah, and I think maybe a parallel example here would be a culture that that has cell phones so prevalently undermines community. That doesn't mean having a cell phone's wrong. It just means be wise with how you use it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And again, even that last comment about it's more conjecture. It's not theory. But again, I'm just pulling from what they said.
Mm-hmm.
Those were 1960s predictions, not infallible rules for life. And we'll never know whether they were right or wrong in a sense, because we have mass prevalence of contraception. So we can't, I don't think we can know. But yeah, I never made a comment about the abortion rates, and I don't think abortion rates would go down if we wiped off all contraceptives.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it for this week.
We'll get to those other 3 questions.
Yeah, so we have some questions from a community group. We'll drop that in a different podcast, either later this week or we'll save them for another week. And once again, we want to encourage people, if in your community groups you're coming up with questions, it can be about anything. Some of these questions are about, we have a question here about gambling. We have a question here about the Gloria Patri. We have... I
can answer that in 10 seconds. We just don't sing it because we're not very good singers.
Someone asked why we've noticed we've been reciting the Gloria Patri fairly regularly over the past few months. Is there a reason behind reciting it rather than singing it?
Yeah, we probably should sing it, but yeah.
So there's not really a good reason.
No. You don't want to hear me sing, Matt.
So we have more questions. We'll send those in your community groups. We love those questions. That's a good place to kind of source those things and send them in. It can be about anything. Doesn't have to be about the sermon.
Literally, was
like
anything.
These ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll address these when we have more time for that. But thanks for joining us this week. And as always, tune in Sundays and come to church. Be present. We are Center Grace Church here in Beverly, and yeah, cool. Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.